All right, my friends, things are seriously escalating over there in Syria between the major world powers that are involved in the ongoing battle over there. And of course, as I mentioned in many previous videos when I'm talking about the events over there in Syria, I've talked about how this is all foreshadowing the end-time prophecies on the destruction of Damascus by Jeremiah and Isaiah. I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the video, but I've got 2 or 3 reports I want to share with you guys. We're going to look at how a U.S. warplane has shot down a Syrian army jet near Raqqa in Syria, and how Russia came out and threatened to target U.S. coalition aircraft now. As a result, they've terminated some safe airspace agreements over Syria that they had with the U.S. Russia did, and the U.S. has responded, so the war rhetoric, the saber rattling between nations is going back and forth as these signs of the times continue to play out here. And so this first piece was reported yesterday, in which a U.S. warplane shot down a Syrian army jet in the southern Raqqa countryside, and it had Washington saying that the jet had dropped bombs near U.S.-backed forces, and Damascus saying the plane was down while flying a mission against the Islamic State militants. So again, conflicting reports from either side there. And a Syrian army statement released on Syrian state television said the plane crashed and the pilot was missing. And it said the incident took place Sunday afternoon, so yesterday afternoon, near a village called Raqqa. And the Syrian army said the flagrant attack was an attempt to undermine the efforts of the army as the only effective force capable with its allies. And this comes, it says, at a time when the Syrian army and its allies were making clear advances in fighting the Islamic State Daesh terrorist group there. The Syrian army went on to say, and later the U.S. Central Command issued a statement saying the Syrian plane was downed in collective self-defense of coalition-partnered forces, identified as fighters of the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, near Raqqa. Now, folks, if you're not familiar with what's going on over there, you've got the U.S. and Western-backed coalition forces backing these, what they're calling moderate rebels that are fighting against the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad, who are backed by Russia, Iran, and other nations. But these are the major players right now that are in the midst of this, and that led to this next piece that was released a couple hours ago, and it was talking about how the Russians, the Kremlin over in Russia, came out and issued a warning after the U.S. downed the Syrian jet. And it goes on to say, and I'll link you up to it as well, of course, in the description box below, that Russia has come out and warned the U.S.-led coalition fighting in Syria that it will view its aircraft as targets after a Syrian military plane was shot down. The coalition said it had shot down the Syrian Su-22 after it bombed U.S.-backed rebels in the Raqqa province on Sunday, so yesterday. And it says, Russia, Syria's main ally, said it was also halting communication with the U.S. aimed at preventing air incidents. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but it says that Syria condemned America's, what they called, a flagrant attack, saying it would have dangerous repercussions. And in a quote here from the Russian Defense Ministry, they said any aircraft, including planes and drones belonging to the international coalition operating west of the Euphrates River, will be tracked by Russian anti-aircraft forces in the sky and on the ground and treated as targets. And that's a quote right out of the Russian Defense Ministry. And it denied the U.S. had used a communications channel before the Su-22 fighter bomber was down. And the U.S. had previously said, and I forgot to mention that they had contacted the Russians. Russians are saying they weren't contacted. Okay, so again, we see conflicting reports from either side, highly symbolic of the simmering tensions and serious escalation that's going on here in what was already an apocalyptic-like scenario happening over there that is as I said many times, foreshadowing end-time Bible prophecy. And it goes on to say the memorandum of cooperation with the coalition aimed at preventing air incidents and guaranteeing flight safety was ending as of Monday, the Russian Defense Ministry added. And the downing of a Syrian warplane by a U.S. jet threatens to draw Washington further into the Syrian fighting, which is probably exactly what they want. And, you know, for people who know what's really going on behind the scenes. But, you know, a lot of that isn't as important as the fact that these things are happening and it's prophesied in the scriptures. And goes on to mention in the piece here that the U.S. has already attacked pro-government forces on the ground after they entered an exclusion zone designed to protect U.S. personnel training and advising anti-government rebels near Syria's border with Iraq. And now Washington is extending this protection to forces that it backs who are engaged in the offensive against Raqqa. These local tactical steps inevitably could have strategic implications, creating a further source of friction between Washington and Tehran. So we're seeing that Iran is going to be becoming more and more involved here. In fact, they've already been very involved. Iran's focus is increasingly on the border region between Syria and Iraq recently, and the struggle for control of this crucial territory is becoming ever more dangerous. And goes on to mention how Iran's own missile strikes against what it says are Islamic State targets underscores Tehran's willingness to act in defense of its own interests there in Syria. And the cooperation had been halted, as I alluded to previously, after the U.S. Launched 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles at Syria's Shayrat air base back in April in response to a suspected chemical weapons attack on a rebel-held town in the Idlib province, which many believe was completely fabricated, including the Russians and their allies. And it goes on to mention that, however, the U.S. and Russia had agreed to resume communications last month. And now the Su-22 fighter bomber was engaged by an Fa-18E Super Hornet after it had dropped bombs near the town of Raqqa in the Raqqa province yesterday afternoon, according to the Pentagon. Now, it is believed to be the first air-to-air kill of a manned aircraft by a U.S. military jet since the Kosovo campaign back in 1999, and the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces were operating there in the Raqqa area. And the SDF have been fighting the Islamic State militants as part of a drive to retake the city of Raqqa, the Islamic State stronghold, further to the east. And a statement from the U.S.-led coalition's Operation Inerrant Resolve said pro-government militiamen had attacked SDF units, driving them from the town of Jadin. And the U.S.-led coalition conducted what it said was a show of force, a reported buzzing of pro-government troops by jets to, what they're saying, to stop the attack, and then called Russia to try to de-escalate the situation and stop the firing. However, the Su-22 dropped bombs on SDF positions, it says, a few hours later, according to the coalition, and in accordance with the rules of engagement and in collective self-defense of coalition-partnered forces, the plane was immediately shot down. And attempts to warn the plane away using an emergency radio frequency failed, according to the U.S. Central Command. Now, the Russians and their allies are saying that there was no warning. It was immediately shot down. And so you're going to see there's much conflicting reports on either side. And the coalition statement went on to add that the demonstrated hostile intent and actions of pro-regime forces toward coalition and partner forces in Syria conducting legitimate counter-Islamic State operations will not be tolerated. The coalition, it added, did not seek to fight the Syrian regime, Russian or pro-regime forces partnered with them, but will not hesitate to defend coalition or partner forces from any threat, including the aforementioned, the Russians And the Syrian army said its warplane had been on a mission against the Islamic State when it came under fire, according to a report from state local television over there. And it said the incident would have dangerous repercussions on efforts to fight terrorism. And an army statement that was released afterward said the pilot of the plane was actually missing. And although this is the first time the coalition has shot down a Syrian jet, there have been an increasing number of incidences between the two sides. And earlier this month, the U.S. shot down a pro-Syrian government-armed drone after it fired at coalition forces near the Al-Tanf border crossing between Syria and Iraq. Then in May, U.S.-led coalition aircraft bombed a convoy of pro-Syrian government forces who were reportedly moving towards a base at Al-Tanf being used by rebel fighters and Western special forces. Then one of the things it mentions in the piece here is back in September of 2016, U.S.-led coalition planes targeting Islamic State positions instead killed Syrian troops. And the U.S. expressed regret afterward for the incident, which Russia said left 62 plus troops dead. And in a separate incident on Sunday, aside from all of this, Iran's Revolutionary Guard said they had launched several missiles from Iran into eastern Syria, targeting Islamic State fighters. And the Guard said they had fired these mid-range ground-to-ground missiles from western Iran, targeting the headquarters and meeting place and suicide car assembly line of Islamic State terrorists in the Deir al-Zur province. And a large number of militants were killed and equipment and weapons were destroyed, according to report from the Guards. And the missiles were apparently in response to an Islamic State-claimed attack on the Iranian parliament earlier this month, which killed more than a dozen people, if you remember that, where the attackers stormed the Iranian parliament. And I believe there were suicide bombers and what have you, gunmen. And it says here in a statement from the Iran Guards that the spilling of any pure blood will not go unanswered. Iran has been a key ally of President Assad, sending military advisors and thousands of troops to the region. So they've already been heavily involved over there, along with the Russians, as we've seen in the reports there in the recent months. And so, as I mentioned, folks, Russia has come out and Moscow has said that they're terminating their communication channel with the United States entirely. Under the memorandum for preventing incidents in Syria's skies as a consequence for the U.S. downing of the Syrian Su-22 plane. And that was, again, as I mentioned before, from Russia's defense ministry that was reported on Monday. And I'll also include this piece from the Russian TASS news agency talking about this. But here's the exact quote from the statement. And it says, as of June 19th, today, of this year, it says, the Defense Ministry of the Russian Federation has ended its interaction with the U.S. side under a memorandum for preventing incidents and providing for safe flights during operations in Syria, and demands that the U.S. command carry out a careful investigation and report about its results and the measures taken. The Defense Ministry went on to say, the shooting down of a Syrian Air Force jet in Syria's airspace is a cynical violation of Syria's sovereignty. The U.S. And their repeated combat operations under the guise of combating terrorism against the legitimate armed forces of a UN member state are a flagrant violation of international law. In addition to being actual military aggression against the Syrian Arab Republic and their allies, including the Russians, the ministry said. Goes on to talk about how Russia will regard any flights within the area of its Air Force Group's operation in Syria as legitimate targets now, the Russian Defense Ministry stressed. And they said in the report that any aircraft, including planes and drones of the international coalition detected in the operation areas west of the Euphrates River by the Russian Air Forces, will be followed by Russian ground-based air defense and air defense aircraft as air targets. We consider the actions of the U.S. command as a deliberate default on their obligations under the memorandum on preventing incidents and providing for safe flights during operations in Syria that was actually signed back on October 20th of 2015. And again, this is a report from the Russian Defense Ministry. I'll link you up to it. But there you have it, folks. I'll link you up to those 3 reports. U.S. warplane shoots down a Syrian army jet, and Russia comes back and threatens now that any aircraft, drones, warplanes, what have you, flying in their airspace where they're operating will be seen as targets now, and they severed their communication channel and their agreement for basically a safe airspace above Syria there. And again, folks, these events, as I said, are foreshadowing the prophecies in Isaiah 17 and Jeremiah 49 on the destruction of Damascus. And if you remember, concerning Damascus, Jeremiah prophesied in Jeremiah 49 that Damascus would be waxed feeble, and that fear and anguish would seize and overtake the city as a woman in labor. And Isaiah prophesied in Isaiah 17, the burden of Damascus, behold, is taken away. Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. Folks, it's getting way late in the game here. The signs of the times are here. I pray you're right with the Lord. Pray you've repented of your sins and that you're born again by the Holy Spirit through your faith in Jesus Christ today and exercising that faith every day. This is Brother Joey signing off once again. Much love to you all and many blessings. We're going to look at how a U.S. warplane has shot down a Syrian army jet near Raqqa in Syria, and how Russia came out and threatened to target U.S. coalition aircraft now. As a result, they've terminated some safe airspace agreements over Syria that they had with the U.S. Russia did, and the U.S. has responded, so the war rhetoric, the saber rattling between nations is going back and forth. Syrian army statement released on Syrian state television said the plane crashed and the pilot was missing. And it said the incident took place Sunday afternoon, so yesterday afternoon, near a village called Raqqa. And the Syrian army said the flagrant attack was an attempt to undermine the efforts of the army as the only effective force capable with its allies. And this comes, it says, at a time when the Syrian army and its allies were making clear advances in fighting the Islamic State Daesh terrorist group there. The Syrian army went on to say, and later the U.S. Central Command issued a statement saying the Syrian plane was downed in collective self-defense of coalition-partnered forces, identified as fighters of the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, near Raqqa. Now, folks, if you're not familiar with what's going on over there, you've got the U.S. and Western-backed coalition forces backing these, what they're calling moderate rebels. All right, my friends, things are seriously escalating over there in Syria between the major world powers that are involved in the ongoing battle over there. And, of course, as I mentioned in many previous videos when I'm talking about the events over there in Syria, I've talked about how this is all foreshadowing the end-time prophecies on the destruction of Damascus by Jeremiah and Isaiah. I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the video, but I've got 2 or 3 reports I want to share with you guys as these signs of the times continue to play out here. And so this first piece was reported yesterday, in which a U.S. warplane shot down a Syrian army jet in the southern Raqqa countryside, and it had Washington saying that the jet had dropped bombs near U.S.-backed forces, and Damascus saying the plane was down while flying a mission against the Islamic State militants. So again, conflicting reports from either side there. And a